Thanks, everyone, for joining us for Podcast and the City this evening. I thought before we, grill our wonderful panel with all the questions, I have a question for those of you in the audience this evening. Is there anyone here in the audience who's never listened to a podcast? And you can go ahead and put your hand up. It's a safe space. You won't be mocked or shamed or made fun of. Yeah? You've never heard a podcast? Okay. I'm hoping this panel is going to change your mind about that. And how about the rest of you over here? Do we have any regular podcast listeners? You have a podcast you like to tune into every week? Yes? Okay. What kind of genres of podcasts are you interested in? Okay. History. And how about you? Okay, anyone? Yes, okay, with Harsha Bhogle, fantastic. Anyone else? What kind of podcasts do you like listening to? Anyone want to? Speculative fiction, any fans of the Bridgerton podcast here? Was there an answer from the back? Okay, well, I think whatever your interest is, and no matter how niche that interest may be, the fantastic thing about podcasts is that there's definitely someone out there in the world who shares that super niche interest and wants to talk about it through their podcast. But today we have these three fantastic panelists who are all podcast hosts of shows that look at city living and urban spaces through very different lenses. And I think rather than me talk about it, I'm going to hand over to each of them and ask them to talk a little bit more about the podcast that they make and why they're interested in that aspect of urban living or cities. Maybe we can start with you, Sneha. Tell us a little bit about the Feminist City, what it's about, and also I think there's an interesting reason why you gave it that name, right, your podcast? So over to you.
Inviting me to be a part of this panel. And thank you so much for that question, Menaka. So I'm the creator and host of the podcast, the Feminist City podcast series. I'm a lawyer by training, so our jobs are usually rooted in legal research, and they don't really concern, I mean, in the sense that my work usually involved more text-based research rather than what actually happens, in reality, so to speak, rather than what's written in the books. And I remember as a young woman working on urban planning and urban governance, women's safety is a question that always came up, and it always keeps coming back up not only in India, but across the world, because there's always one deeply violent incident that happens and people start paying attention to it. So I think sometime in 2019, I just started thinking about criminal law from a feminist perspective, because this was around the time when there was that really grotesque rape and murder that happened in Hyderabad, where a young veterinarian was murdered. Now, what happened was horrible enough, but then there was an encounter killing right after. And that was it was personally very disturbing to me. I'm also from Hyderabad. It was around the time I started thinking about the fact that nobody was paying attention to cities and how cities themselves were being planned. And often criminal law only comes into action ex post facto, right, after the incident of the violence. So I wrote a report called Making a Feminist City, looking at urban planning, to make cities safer for women, but also with a focus on women's autonomy. To me, that question of women's autonomy is something that's just not asked. So the podcast sort of came back because I felt like, as a researcher, we're always thinking about ways in which we want to communicate our research findings. And I wanted this podcast to reach young women in cities, and I wanted to reach all women in cities. And women don't have time. They're usually really busy. And there is something very unique about a podcast, because you can be cooking, you can be cleaning, and you can be listening to it in the background. So that was very important to me. And so the podcast also started because I wanted to advocate a way of thinking about the city that centers girls and women, which I felt like wasn't happening. And one of the quotes I think I quoted in my report by Jane Dark, where she says, patriarchy is built into brick, stone, and mortar. It's everywhere in the city. And once you start looking at it, you'll see it all the time, everywhere. So there was a story I'd read called Sultana's Dream. And it's a short story. I would encourage everybody to go back and read it. It was written in 1905 by Begum Ruqayya Sakhawat. And she describes a dream where she wakes up in Ladyland, where there were women everywhere. She talks about a city that is lined with botanical gardens. It is a city without police. It is a city where everybody worked for 2 hours a day. And the men were taking care of the children and cleaning, and the women were engaged in scientific advancement. And it was amazing. And I kept thinking of what a utopian vision that was, and how as a feminist utopian vision, it wasn't limited to women's freedom. It was directed at violence at the heart of every form, in our society. So that was where the idea started, and I just wanted to make something, because one thing I wanted to do is that next time there was an incident of violence, I don't want someone to say more CCTV cameras. They do not work. There is enough research, and not more cops, but more women occupying public space. And that's when it started, and I have to say, the podcast wouldn't exist without the wonderful researchers, activists, and people who have been working on this topic from a variety of perspectives, and they so graciously give me their time. And so, yeah, I'm sorry if I've took up too much time, but that's a short introduction to the podcast.
Thank you so much for that, Sneha. Okay. Ikyatha, over to you. You are the host of Slangaluru, and you've got your first episode has come out pretty recently, and it's a really, really interesting way at looking at Bangalore. So can you tell us a little bit about your podcast and what you hope to do with it?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Ikyatha here. Before I start off, I just want to know from you, how many of you can understand and speak Kannada? Okay, that's not bad. And give a round of applause to yourselves, because probably this is the first time where in a room full of people, more than half of them have said, I can understand and speak Kannada in Bangalore. So, there's this very popular joke that says you can be born and brought up in Bangalore, you could have lived for 20, 30, 40 years, and you can still survive in the city without knowing Kannada, which is very true, because I have a lot of Bangalorean friends who call themselves Bangalorean. They're born and brought up here, but they do not understand Kannada or speak Kannada. So that, I think, kind of reflects on the fact that Bangalore is a very welcoming city, and a Bangalorean is someone who will converse with you in your own language. For instance, if there's someone from North India, especially the IT crowd, right? So many people who converse in Hindi. So we'll make an effort to talk to you in Hindi. If there's someone who's come from some other state, probably Tamil Nadu, we would have picked up here and there, we would have picked up some Tamil words. So we'll converse with you in Tamil. So we're very accommodating that way. So, but when Slangaluru, I had no idea of starting a podcast, honestly. When Sochcast approached me, specifically Mr. Ganesh Sharma from Sochcast approached me and said, we want you to host a podcast series where you will teach Kannada. And I obviously said yes, because teaching conversational Kannada is fun, right? And it's also a fun way to learn. You're not forcing things upon people, because every time there's this language war that happens, this North Indian, South Indian, Hindi versus Kannada. I mean, yeah, it's all nice to make memes out of it, but ultimately you can't force anything on another person. And there's already too much hate going on in the country. So it's easier to teach through a podcast in a simple, fun way, and people are also very receptive, because I have a lot of people who follow Slangaluru who are not from Bangalore. They follow the page because they want to know about Bangalore, and they're very open towards it. So if you actually interact with real people and not people on Twitter, you'll actually know that people are cordial and they have empathy. So just don't get on Twitter and judge people based on that. So, and when I started, we've only recorded one episode till now, and we're going to record the upcoming episodes soon. So it's an audience of both Kannadigas and non-Kannadigas, people who want to learn the language. So apart from conversational Kannada, I told Sochcast, why not teach them slang also? Because that's what Slangaluru stands for. And the whole fun element comes in there, because I will soon get to it about the slang and its traits, Bangalore slang and its traits. But yeah, so for now, we have the first segment, which teaches conversational Kannada, and the second part, which teaches Bangalore slang. So that's how it started. Do
do we need it? Oh, dear.
So, that one's really loud. So from a feminist perspective of the city to slang and spoken Kannada, we have Radhika here, who's repping two podcasts, City of Women and Uru. You have to speak about both. So can you tell us a little bit about both these podcasts, please?
Hi. Okay, I'm audible. It's always a bit nerve-wracking with the mic. So, hi everyone. I am Radhika. I make podcasts for a living. I mean, this is something that I've been doing for about 5 years now. I am a researcher by training, an economist, and I set up a company along with my co-founder, Samyukta, who's over there, so she'll just say hi. This is quite informal, so you can jump in anytime. And City of Women is actually, I think, the third show that we made. So, I think I'm very similar in sort of training and the work that we did sort of to Sneha, and we were very interested in questions of gender and labor, and these are questions that we have sort of looked at in our first podcast, In the Field, which is kind of a show about development in India, and it's kind of the more traditional, say, documentary style show. But I think for us, when we made City of Women, we wanted to we wanted a show that was very much rooted in around questions of gender and public space. But, we used to talk, it was about 2 years it took us to sort of design the show and think about it. We're like, what does it sound like? What does it sound like? Do we want to have people sort of talking and giving their views and opinions and experts being interviewed? And we're like, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's not that. And I think what we arrived at was, look, in the end, a lot of the narratives around women in the public space are very rightly around, and very rightly so, around sort of safety and sort of events that happen to them, safety and violence and things like that. But what we realized was that when we talk amongst ourselves, we have a lot of personal experiences of things happening to us in the public space that we don't really share. And it's really the kind of story that is momentarily very meaningful to you. So, women are out and about in the city all the time. You could be going to work, you could be going out for pleasure, you could be going out because you have to. And then something will happen to you. Invariably, something happens to you on the street, right? And then it's something that will last 5 minutes. It could be uncomfortable, it could be euphoric, it could be anything, but it's a real burst of something that happens. So there's an encounter. And then it may stay with you in your mind. You may come home and call your girlfriend or call your mom or call someone and say, hey, this happened to me. And I think we realized that it's those kind of stories. But if I ask you about it and say, hey, would you like to tell me about something that has happened to you while you were on the street? You will invariably say, I don't have an interesting story. It's really. And then I'll say, but what about that time when you went on the bus and that something happened to you? And then, invariably, the person will say, well, that's not really interesting, but it is interesting. And often we find that in the storytelling of it, there's a lot of agency that the woman storyteller has. There's sort of a reclamation of the experience, whether it's good or bad, and you're creating something new out of it. And so that's basically where City of Women came from. It's narratives of women telling stories about what happened to them on the street. And it's a joyride. We call it a joyride because it's funny. There's a lot of action if you listen to it. You feel a bit like you're in a movie, because that's kind of how it is when you're on the street. You're constantly like, something's going to happen. You don't even just simple things like crossing the road. You don't cross the road. You're like, oh, I'm going to cross the road, but then I can see that guy coming, and then there's a car, and then this, and there's a bike coming, and then, the bike will swear at me, and then I'll shout back at him, and then, we'll momentarily for 5 seconds have a fight, and then I'll just go off on my day, and I'll tell someone about it. So it's those moments that we are trying to capture in the show. I have to talk about Uru. So Uru is a really interesting show. I think I will say in other countries, there is, you have very strong city sentiments. And there are, in podcasting itself, in audio itself, you have many city shows, that are sort of deeply rooted in the aesthetic and in the identity of the city, but, talk about civic issues, local issues, whatever. And the idea of Uru was to make a show around the idea of sustainability in the city. We're making it in partnership with the Bengaluru Sustainability Forum. And I think all of you will know that there's always this, people always say that there's a very high civic engagement or civic interest in Bangalore. So we were very interested, the BSF was very interested in sort of exploring that and saying, what does that really mean? Right? We talk a lot about sustainability goals, SDGs. What does that mean? How do you connect those high, lofty goals with the conversations on the ground? So it's not even like what are people doing, but what are people saying and thinking? And so how do you make that connect? How do you make a city show that people will feel like, hey, this is my voice. This is, talking about my neighborhood, and somehow connecting it to larger kind of things that are happening in the world. So Uru is that. We were supposed to release it, I think, a year ago. Unfortunately, the pandemic came in the way, so it's having a slightly delayed release, like Top Gun 2. I don't know if it'll be that exciting. Maybe it will. But the trailer's out. It's available everywhere, and the episodes are going to drop really soon.
Thank you so much. So all of you, we have a journalist, we have someone who's into research and policy. Radhika, you have a background in development. I'm really curious to know, and you all, of course, communicate in these roles, right? It's a really important part of what you do. What is it about podcasting as a medium that draws you to it? And I'd like to start with you, Sneha. I think you'd put up an Instagram story saying that you think podcasts are particularly a great medium for women, to communicate through. I'm interested to know why you say that.
So I just finished recording an episode with Dr. Uma Chakravarti. She's a very noted historian, and she's an oral historian. And one thing I've often noticed is, and I was thinking about that when I realized that the panel was all women about podcasts. It wasn't necessarily a gender topic, right? Because usually that's what happens. There's something about gender or women, and then suddenly everybody's like, oh, let's invite all women. So I was very... Yeah, or no women on that panel. So here I was thinking about what organically draws so many women towards a medium such as this, and particularly about the city. First thing I thought was, when you don't have access to a space, you think about it a lot more than somebody who can take that for granted. Because I think I spend so much time thinking about the city because I don't think I feel comfortable and safe in my own body when I'm moving out. But secondly, the reason I felt that women in particular might feel comfortable is because oral histories are women's histories. And often a lot of people who do feminist research find that there's no archival evidence or there's no archives on women. And it's through narrative. And when I was very struck when you were talking about storytelling in terms of, and this is also something that I remember talking, and I don't think I have the research sources to cite, but I know female academics, friends of mine, we all struggle to write because we're so concerned that what we know is not good enough to put in paper and publish. And I often feel like women, while talking, are more comfortable telling their story. And to me, there is something fundamentally feminist about it, is because narrative is always personal. But in that storytelling, you are touching something that's deeply political as well. And to me, that sort of epitomizes a kind of dialectical relationship between the personal and the political in narrative. So I've often, what you were describing, a particular type of joy, I felt that when I was recording podcasts with women who were older than me, my age. I always thought we talk about feminist killjoys, but it was a feminist joy for me. Like for me, when I listen, or even to my own podcast, listening to and I'm like, wow. And I listen to other podcasts where women are talking to each other. It is so joyful. And also there is something about, because another reason why I also felt that podcasts have something to do with women in particular is because women don't have public spaces we can congregate together in. Often if you look at the city, where do a bunch of women get together? One, they're usually too busy. Two, they don't have a cafe, or there are no addas hanging out in. So, we document one or two whatever places, but podcasts then become uniquely suited because it's easy to access, it's exceptionally, Yeah, so I think it's a range of conditions. I don't think anybody's sitting out and like thinking about it, but it just happens. So that's basically what I was thinking when I said I think women have a particular relationship with narrative in particular. Yeah. So sorry, the question, to answer the question of why I chose to do it as a podcast, I wanted it to be accessible. I wanted anybody, a non-lawyer, lawyer, anybody, and I know this is in English, so I know automatically that means it's limited to a certain set of audience. But I kept thinking, and I remember I rehearsed my first episode with my mom, and I said, I just hope that somebody listening to this podcast can convince her parents to let her go out whenever she wants, because her being out in the city is going to make the city safer for other women. So that was basically why I wanted it to reach women in the city.
No, I just wanted to add that you're extremely articulate, and I think you put it very well when you spoke about sort of like why you chose to do it. Well, you know, that the fact that women hesitate to talk about their experiences. I mean, this is something that also was why we went with the format we went, because as researchers we're trained. So you start and say, okay, shall I write a lit review about this? Okay, now should I write like a paper and then get experts to talk about feminine experiences? And then we were like, no, let's chuck that, because let's just talk about the experience itself. It doesn't replace it, but it can stand alongside all of the other kind of research or literature, whatever that's available, and it should stand alongside. So let's just do that. So, yeah.
Right, so I had a lot of ideas for Slangaluru, and because you mentioned YouTube channel, maybe it will happen sometime in the future. But like Sneha was saying, firstly, what you're doing is really impressive. I just wanted to say that. And like she was saying, you know, ease of accessibility. Anybody can listen to it, can access it. Anyway, it's passive communication, right? It's not like a video or a YouTube channel where you have to concentrate and you have to dedicate your time to it. Even Instagram is a visual medium, but with a podcast, you can listen to it at any point, whether you're gymming or cooking or driving. And especially during the pandemic, I know that a lot of people individually started making podcasts, and podcasts became a huge hit in the last 2 years, because a lot of people have told me that you know, they didn't even know what podcasting was, but the pandemic changed a lot of things. And a lot of people took to podcasting. And because there is something challenging about, I am usually, Slangaluru doesn't make too many videos. They're mostly a lot of text, and then we convey emotions through text. But here, for me also, it's a new challenge to kind of take people down memory lane or give them a nostalgia trip through audio. It's completely different from text, right? So I thought that's something that's really challenging, because we are coming up with something called a Bangalore History Series. We already have that on our page. So we talk about the stories, the unique stories behind, you know, the places that we grew up visiting, like Plaza Theatre and Rex and Galaxy. And today's kids will never know the joy of, you know, shouting and screaming first day, first show in a single screen theatre. So it kind of revives and makes people recollect what they grew up with. And say Vidyarthi Bhavan or CTR. So we are going to include trivia about those as well. So this is something where you evoke nostalgia, and that is why people can relate to it.
So I think this is a nice kind of point in the discussion to pause, and we've asked our panelists to bring a clip from their podcasts and to play it for us. So that's going to be quite fun. So it's nice to also hear the podcast that they've been talking about. So I think, who should we start with first? Okay, Ikyatha, do you want to just kind of set up the clip that you're going to play? And we'll play first from Slangaluru.
Should I?
Do you just want to introduce the clip before we hit play?
So this is a small bit from the first episode. The first segment is, of course, me teaching conversational Kannada, and then comes the slang bit. So yeah, you can go ahead and play it. Now that I've taught you conversational Kannada, let's move to my favorite part of the podcast, which is Kannada and Bengaluru slang. I'm going to teach you some fun Bengaluru slang. And before I start off, so Bangalore is a cosmopolitan city it's a melting pot of cultures, and there are people from all over the country. So Bangalore slang mainly comprises Kannada slang, which obviously is our mother tongue. And there's also a bit of Konglish slang, which is a combination of Kannada and English words. When I come to the teaching bit, you'll see how much fun Konglish is actually. And there's also Bangalore English, which is a localized colloquial version of actual English. And I'm sure that you're in for a treat in this segment. So I'm going to teach you 3 slang words that we often use in the city, with the first one being Sakkat. Sakkat means super, incredible, awesome, or fantastic. And another word which also means the same thing is Bombat. So you can see a lot of Bangaloreans saying Bombat agittu, which means it was fantastic. And the third word is Maga. Maga actually means son, S-O-N, son in conversational Kannada, but when you're using it in a slangish way, it means bro or dude or bob. So let me use all 3 words in a sentence so that you understand how they're used. For instance, Maga, let's go to Meghna's and belt Bombat biryani. Sakkat it'll be. Which means, dude, let's go to Meghna's and binge on some amazing biryani. It'll be super. You know, the funny part about Bangalore slang is how much you drag the word or sentence, in what tone you say it, at what volume you say it. All this makes a huge difference to how much effect the word or the sentence can have. For instance, if you want to use the same words that I mentioned just now, AVD is playing really well at Chinnaswamy Stadium, and probably his best performance ever. So you look at your friend and you go, Maga, did you see ABD's batting? Bombat, it was sakkatittu kano. So you know, dragging the Maga and making it Maga actually makes a huge difference to how effective the sentence or the word is. This is just one funny trait of Bengaluru slang. There are more coming up in the upcoming episodes, so stay tuned, Maga.
Just say, after I listened to the first episode, I was feeling really hopeful because at the start of the pandemic, you know, when everyone was being super annoying and learning languages, and I was one of those people, I signed up for online Kannada classes, and then I got kicked out because I didn't do any of the homework. So I'm really looking forward to learning Kannada with Slangaluru in a no-pressure environment. So thank you so much for that.
I've been learning Kannada as well, and I was actually in classes before the pandemic started, and I couldn't go anymore because I was going in, you know, in-person classes. But one thing I struggled with is nobody teaches you slang in the class. So this was amazing. Also, I'm a huge fan of Meghna's. So I was particularly touched, by the sentence you used in this. So yeah, thank you. I'm gonna be waiting for the upcoming episodes as well.
Sure, so the 2 of you can tune in and the next panel discussion can be in Kannada then.
Radhika, do you want to play? Yeah, and set the clip up for us, why don't you?
Okay, so we're going to play the trailer for Uru, which is a show about Bengaluru and sustainability, and it's brought to you by the Bengaluru Sustainability Forum. Unfortunately, Mansi from the BSF was unable to be here today, but we're going to play the clip anyway.
Some questions about Bengaluru are very easy to answer.
What are the 5 things you think about when you think of Bengaluru? Beautiful weather,
Silicon City of India,
traffic, innovation,
and pollution,
and microbreweries.
That's a no-brainer.
Other questions? Less so.
Do you feel a part of Bangalore's story? I struggle with this question.
Every other person here is in software.
But there's a certain set of questions most people in the city spend a lot of time debating, thinking, worrying, and tweeting about.
Do you think we'll run out of food and water?
Food, I'm not too sure, but potable water, definitely.
We have a serious water problem.
Do you think Bangalore is sustainable? What does that even mean?
I don't really think Bangalore is sustainable.
We had exploded and grown out 300%.
ನಗರದ ನಿರ್ಣಯಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ನಾಗರಿಕನಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಹೇಗೆ ಭಾಗವಹಿಸಲಿ
ಕಸದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಫಸ್ಟ್ is the main garbage.
And to top it all, the non-participation of citizens.
That is not correct, madam.
Because they still don't have the answers.
It's changing now and I want to know why.
But you have to make way for how a city grows. And you have to make peace with it.
What is SDG?
Not a clue.
Uru is a new podcast about Bengaluru and its future. Join us as we find out what we're doing to plan for our city's sustainability. For our food, our water, our trees, our lakes, our streets, and our lives. Uru is brought to you by the Bengaluru Sustainability Forum and Visakha Media. Uru is coming soon, so subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Or follow us on social media. We're at SustainBLR and at Visakha Media.
So thank you, Bangalore.
Just fell in love with the place.
Sneha, do you want to set up your clip from Feminist City?
Yeah, so this is not going to be as fun as the other two clips you've heard. The clip that I picked was from an episode that I recorded with Deepa Pawar. She's an activist from Bombay who runs this wonderful organization called Anubhuti Trust. She predominantly works with young people and women in Bombay. And Deepa is from, I sent a huge clip. We can maybe listen to just like 2.5 minutes of it. So my podcast is generally in English, but this episode was recorded mostly in Hindi. And so in case somebody does not understand Hindi, I'll be happy to translate for you. In this podcast, in this episode, we were particularly talking about urban development priorities and whether they're actually set by or set keeping in mind people in the grassroots in mind at all. And she's one of the most inspiring people I've ever met. I've never had a more impactful conversation. This was something that deeply impacted me. Also because she is somebody who's worked, she's from a nomadic and denotified tribe and a community. And she talks about a concept called mental justice. And Deepa is one of the most, and I felt like in her work and what she's doing in the city was epitomizing both a feminist perspective, but also thinking about justice in your everyday work. So I'll just let her speak.
तो राइट टू पी कैंपेन के अंदर जब हमने शुरुआत की थी तो हमारा एक मामूली सवाल था जो सारे लोगों को पता है कि शहरों के अंदर जो पेन यूज के टॉयलेट है, राइट, उसके अंदर हमने एक आरटीआई के जरिए जानकारी ली थी कि कितने यूरिनल्स फॉर मैन है और कितने यूरिनल फॉर जो है वो फीमेल है। तो उसके अंदर 0 यूरिनल्स जो है वो औरतों के लिए थे और करीबन 2500 से भी ज्यादा जो यूरिनल थे वो मर्दों के लिए थे, राइट। तो ये सिंपल स्ट्रक्चरल बिल्डिंग क्यों होता है कि क्यों आता है दिमाग के अंदर कि पुरुषों के लिए मुतारी की व्यवस्था अलग होनी चाहिए और औरतों के लिए सेपरेट यूरिनल्स की जरूरत नहीं है, क्योंकि आपका पुरुषी बायस्ड दिमाग ये सोचता है कि औरतें तो आपके वर्किंग फोर्स में ही नहीं है और अगर औरतें आपके वर्किंग फोर्स में है तो वो क्लेम नहीं कर सकती है आपके स्ट्रक्चर को, राइट। उनकी इतनी लेवल नहीं है, उनकी इतनी, अगर हम कहें इन शॉर्ट, तो उनकी इतनी औकात नहीं है कि वो आपके स्ट्रक्चर को क्लेम कर सकती है, राइट। इसीलिए आप स्ट्रक्चर बिल्डिंग उस तरह से करते हैं। तो एक्चुअली स्ट्रक्चर जो है ना वो बहुत ज्यादा वॉयलेंस क्रिएट करता है। वो एक सेटल और हिडन वे में, जिसे हम कहें कि अदृश्य हिंसा का परिमाण बन जाता है, एक डिलीवर करता है वो हिंसा और एक भय को, एक दहशत को जो लगातार कर सकता है। तो तब जब हमने सिस्टम से बात की तो उनका कहना था कि अगर हम पुरुषों से पेशाब के पैसे ले तो वो खुले में जाके करेंगे और अगर हम औरतों से पेशाब के पैसे ले तो औरतों तो खुले में पेशाब या शौच नहीं कर सकती है। तो इन शॉर्ट कि अगर पुरुष खुले में पेशाब कर सकते हैं तो आप उनको सर्विसेज दोगे और औरतें किसी 4 दीवारी के अंदर पेशाब करोगी तो आप उनसे भुगतान लोगे, उनके ऊपर पेनल्टी ला दोगे, क्योंकि आप हमारे बॉडी पॉलिटिक्स का पूरा यूज करोगे, आप हमारे शरीर की राजनीति का पूरा जो यूज करके जो है आपकी कैपिटलिस्ट सोच है, वहां पे हमें भुगतान करने को लगाओगे। और इसका असर डेफिनेटली होता है। हमने राइट टू पी के अंदर कई सारे संस्था संगठन जो थे वो इकट्ठा थे और अपने अपने लेवल पे वो संशोधन कर रहे थे। तब पता चला कि औरत भी तो एक नहीं है ना, वो भी अलग अलग क्राइटेरिया में बांटी गई है। तो जब औरत अब डिसेबिलिटी की पहचान लेके आती है, औरत एक प्रेग्नेंट विमेन करके आती है, औरत एक बुजुर्ग औरत करके आती है, वो न्यू मैरिड करके आती है, तो ऐसे सही सारे एंगल में टॉयलेट और सैनिटेशन जैसा इशू उसके ऊपर कितना हावी हो सकता है। औरतों ने कहा कि वो पानी नहीं पीती है घर के बाहर अगर निकलना हो तो, और कई सारे औरतों को जो है वो हेल्थ के इशू को फाइट करना पड़ा है। तो एक सिंपल अगर हम समझे कि शहर विकास, इतनी सिंपल बात क्यों नहीं समझ सकता है कि अगर पुरुषों को पेशाब को लगती है तो औरतों को भी लगती है, और उसके लिए एक ढांचा होना चाहिए, उसके लिए एक स्ट्रक्चर होना चाहिए। तो ये तो सिंपल है ना। तो औरतों के लिए एक जो घृणा, एक पेट्रियार्कल जो सोच है, वो जहां जहां भी आपको मुमकिन है आप शहर विकास में दिखा सकते हो। दूसरा मैं एक एग्जांपल लेती हूँ जो मेरी कम्युनिटी से आता है। मैं खुद नोमैडिक ट्राइब से हूँ, जिसे हम भटके विमुक्त समूह कहते हैं, गुमांतु कहते हैं, माइग्रेंट, एक माइग्रेटरी ट्राइब कहते हैं, जो एक जगह पे नहीं रुकते हैं। लेकिन वो एक जगह पर नहीं रुक रहे थे, आज वो एक जगह पे रुकना चाहते हैं, वो एक जगह पे सेटल होना चाहते हैं। तो क्या शहर की इतनी ताकत है, शहर विकास की इतनी ताकत है, जो ये माइग्रेटरी ट्राइब जो है वो अंग्रेजों के खिलाफ के आंदोलन में अपना कंट्रीब्यूशन दे चुके हैं, अपने घर गृहस्थी, अपनी पूरी कम्युनिटी जो है वो दाव पे लगा चुके हैं। तो इनका उतना ही हक है इस देश पर, मैं तो कहूंगी कि और ज्यादा हक है इस देश पर, जिन्होंने इस देश के फाइट फ्रीडम के मूवमेंट के अंदर जो है बहुत ही तगड़ा कंट्रीब्यूशन दिया है। लेकिन आज आप किसी भी रास्ते के ऊपर नजर घुमाओ, किसी ब्रिज के नीचे नजर घुमाओ,
No, it's supposed to go on, but maybe there's some issue. So she just continues to talk about the fact that, did everybody understand it? Do you want me to? Yeah, I'll just translate it. So Deepa Pawar is part of the Right to Pee campaign, which sort of happened in Maharashtra. So in that, they had filed an RTI, and they wanted to find out how many urinals were built for men and how many urinals were built for women. And they found an extreme disparity between the number of urinals that were built for men and women. And the reason, when she talks about how this is patriarchal urban planning, where she's like, what is their mindset that believes that men require infrastructure to be built, but women don't? And she's like, well, women are not part of the workforce, so they don't create it. And when they sort of pull at that thread, she's also talking about how, so if men are charged, so she's talking about pay and use toilets, and they're fundamentally against pay and use toilets, because if men are charged for a urinal, they will pee on the side of the road. But women can't. Women need a place to go to the bathroom. It's their, it's basically your bodily dignity. So she's like, you are exploiting the body politics of women and you're charging them a penalty. And this is sort of in the patriarchal capitalist structure. And she's describing that this is the way in which structures create invisible violence. And she's talking about how it's not just, also between women it's different. A woman with a disability, an elderly woman, a pregnant woman. Now, pregnant women need to pee multiple times a day. This basically ensures that women just cannot step out. And this is one of the reasons where a lot of women cannot take on jobs in the city, because, you require sanitation as a fundamental facet. She goes on to talk about her community, the nomadic and denotified communities, who had taken part in the freedom struggle against the British, who were migratory tribes once, but who are now settling down in a specific place. And she's asking the question, does the city actually make space for these people? Can they claim space in the city? She goes on to say that this extremely afflicts the young people and women from these communities because they are not thought of, and the worst affected communities and the most marginalized end up paying a higher cost to access public services that we take for granted. So for somebody who's living on a daily wage, paying every time you need to use the toilet is a huge cost. So those are the ways in which, I would encourage everybody to go back and listen to the episode. She talks a lot about it, but yeah, that's basically what she's described.
Thank you so much. Radhika, you want to set up your clip now?
Yeah, sure. So I think it was very hard for us to choose a clip, especially when you make something, everything sounds great. One sec, I'll just set it up. So we can't go back. It's not connected, right, to the internet? I'm so sorry, being a bit troublesome. Yeah, bus 618. So I'll just set this up. This is the story of, it's a monologue narrated by a woman. It's set in Bombay. It's set in the neighborhood of Vakola, if anyone is familiar with Bombay, if you've ever taken a bus. And I think it brings up questions of space. How do you navigate and claim space? How do you find yourself in the city? So we'll just play it. It's slightly long. We can cut it off if we need to, or if...
I used to live in Bombay until 2 years ago, and I used to stay in a really, really crowded area called Vakola in Santa Cruz. Like, I can't even begin to tell you how crowded evenings and early nights used to be outside of Santa Cruz East Station. Markets and buses and auto rickshaws and all of us used to be like in one place and ready to fight or beginning to fight, or, you know, like that kind of a mood at about 8 o'clock in the evenings, you know, because you're desperate to get home. You're already tired from the back journeys of whether it is train or shared taxis or whatever it is, and on a short fuse mostly around that time. There was just this one bus that used to go like in circles. Basically, it would just keep going round and round from the station and take this huge loop and come back. So we all used to wait for this bus to come and hope to get a seat on it. And obviously no one notices anything for a long time, you know, until something becomes an incident. When I got on, I think she was already there and she had already been on this one loop of a ride. And I think somebody pointed out, or the conductor pointed out, that she had already been on this bus. So obviously, if you've already done one loop, then you should have gotten off somewhere. I mean, that's the expectation. Nobody thought of it as a big deal initially, but then suddenly it seemed to escalate into the conductor and the people questioning her as to what she was doing. Like, you know, why was she on the bus for more than one round trip? You know, like, why are you here? Initially, she tried to brush it off. Aapko kya problem hai, sort of a thing. She must have done that thinking that people will kind of move on. She's not troubling anybody. She's just on the bus. But that didn't happen. Initially, I was like, obviously just curious. We want to know what's going on, you know, when there's a fight around us or something like that. But after a point, I really felt like, you know, maybe she's just trying to get away from something for a little while. I do remember people feeling very hostile towards her as to why are you here for more than half an hour. I didn't really make a judgment about where she came from. I generally knew that whoever was on this bus came from really small living spaces. Somebody who's had like perhaps a rough day or has been having rough days for a long time, and she just wants to probably get some fresh air, if you can call it that. I remember thinking she looked tired, and we all know how women get tired. So. And obviously nobody was allowing her that on that bus, because imagine a crowd looking at you, right? And so many random onlookers like me. I didn't do anything about it. I just watched, because I knew that if anybody did step in, it would probably become worse. So then she got flustered. I'm not getting off this bus, but trust me, I haven't done anything wrong. You know, it was like that. But she also knew that she can't stand up and start a full-on fight there. So she did try to also explain that she's not a miscreant or something. Pardon my judgment over here, but you know, you find, especially on Bombay trains, drunk men sleeping in one of the carriages for so long. I don't know how many round trips from one end to the other, and nobody questions them except for an occasional policeman who comes and kind of pokes them and says, "Chalo utro yahan se." But nobody really minds it other than feeling mildly annoyed about it. But this particular woman was definitely questioned for being there. And I think that really got me thinking, because there have been so many times when I have taken these long train rides or a really long bus journey where you're kind of huddled onto your window seat and you're just processing your life a little bit, and really felt better about life by the time the train ride ends. And that was all she was trying to do, and we didn't let her do it. We didn't allow her. And nobody had any accusation other than, why are you here? Nobody knew. She hadn't stolen anything. Nobody had lost anything on the bus. Nobody had been molested on the bus by her. Nobody had been nobody had any real charge against her, but the fact that she was there for more than one round trip. Women definitely use journeys to cope with life. I have cried on train rides. I have seen so many women crying on train rides, processing their grief. The way society kind of gangs up just because something is not common. You don't see women sitting around in loops on journeys. And I keep saying we because the society is all of us, right? It reminded me of this play written by Vijay Tendulkar, Shantata Court Chalu Ahe, the court is in session. It's a story about how eventually somebody is kind of cornered. It starts like a mock exercise, and then as it goes on, it becomes intense, and you can no longer tell whether the jabs are happening for fun, and then it kind of escalates to becoming really hostile towards this woman. And I got that feeling so strongly from that incident, and I really felt for her. I just remember the last lines of the play, Chimni lamak popat bole kago tuze dore ole. The parrot is asking the sparrow, why are your eyes moist? Because she's basically been defeated in a mock game, but the defeat is of the real life. Tendulkar is really known for bringing out the worst of how human nature attacks other human beings in very seemingly normal spaces. You cannot imagine anyone trying to find peace on a 618 bus journey from Santa Cruz station to Akola and back. That's like the last places where you will find peace and solitude, but you have somebody who's trying to get that on that bus.
Thank you so much for all playing these fantastic clips and giving everyone here an idea of what your podcasts sound like. I'm curious, do you think podcasts are a way in which people can engage with their city? Do you think that's possible to do that through the medium of podcasts? How do you want people to feel after they listen to one of your episodes? What would you like them? Do you want them to take a particular action, do something, say something? Any thoughts around that, Sneha?
No, I think definitely, because I felt very moved by what I just heard. And I was just thinking that I'm just releasing season 2 of my podcast, at least one episode, and we're going to do more. This entire season is dedicated to public spaces and shrinking public spaces and how that affects women. Because first of all, there are no women in public spaces already. And what she's describing is, where do you go if you just want to, not be at home? And you don't have to pay for it. You're not questioned for it. And there's a kind of... so the answer to that is a resounding yes, that I think there is definitely some engagement that you can do with your city, especially for those people who do not get unconditional access to the city. So when there is a conditional access, and for women it's, safety. Safety is often the fulcrum. But also for a lot of people, it's money. So, when was the last time anybody's gone to a public library? When was the last time we've gone into a public space where we were not expected to pay? So these are all, I feel like, ways in which we can think of the city. I would really like spaces in the city where nobody's asked for money for doing anything. But when I'm making a podcast, what I think predominantly is, I guess I want people to start thinking about human beings differently. Like when I say a person, I want somebody to think of a woman. And I want them to think about somebody, the very assumptions that sort of we make when we hear certain words. And I guess particularly I wanted women in the city to start thinking about the city from a political perspective. And to me, whether it's language and local politics or sustainability, a lot of these things come down to the everyday experiences of people who live in a particular place. And I think, to me, the reason I adopted feminist urbanism as a lens is that feminist urbanism is nothing but a feminist perspective that focuses on the everyday experiences of people and how those are the place through which policy and laws can be made. And also freedoms are articulated. Because as a law student and as a legal researcher, I'm constantly thinking about the constitutional guarantees. We say we have a right to life, we have a right to freedom, we have a right to, association. All of these rights are contingent on the material provision of infrastructure in the city. They are contingent on groups of people being able to access that rights. As Deepa points out, can women and can girls, can poor people in the city, can a variety of vulnerable groups make that claim to this infrastructure? So I would particularly like the English-speaking audience of my podcast to think about those structures, because in all of our work, we engage with people. So I wanted women to think about their own city politically and realize that they can make a claim to that city and they can get involved in local politics. In fact, I think we should be learning the languages of the place we come from. And I think it's very important for us to get involved in local politics of wherever we are at. So to me, the very important thing is to make sure, check out whether your ward committee is set up, whether the park in your neighborhood is being governed properly. Are there moral policing rules? Are they driving out people who don't look like you? So how do we then build community in a city that is, it makes it so difficult to build community. So I guess I do believe that those are the things I guess I want people to take away from, because there is a historical silence around women in academic disciplines. We can study for 5 years in college and not learn a thing about how women lived or how women live. So yeah, I think that's where I would like to start.
Fantastic, thanks for that. And Radhika, what about you? I mean, with City of Women, for example, these are intensely personal narrative stories that women are sharing. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of feedback and response you've gotten from listeners and how you interact with listeners, about the themes that you explore through the episodes?
So I think one is the community around City of Women is really important for us. When we make our episodes, they are as much, they really belong to the community, and we try our best. We do some, I don't know if we do enough, but we are constantly trying to speak to women. I must add here that our show is called City of Women, and we sort of showcase stories of women, but we've had a lot of responses from all sorts of people who sort of say, hey, this was my experience in the city. It's not limited to gender or, or anything, any other identity. It's really about what is it like to live in a city. So I think the response has been great. One of the things when Samyukta and I started working in audio 5 years ago was some great feedback we got for our first pilot that we shared with a focus group was, I hate the sound of your voice. It sounds like nails on a board, and that's great. Imagine you're pivoting your career and then someone gives you this great feedback. We also got feedback like, why do you want to make a complex story like this? Just put a mic and just put it up on YouTube, why go through all the effort? It's basically your work is not worth it. And I think one of the things we took away from that is that you don't hear women's voices enough in India. I think it really makes people deeply uncomfortable at some level to hear women talk about their experiences, especially the joyful ones. The Bus 618 is a very moving story. There are some really entertaining episodes we've put out there. We have an episode which is just 60 seconds of women laughing. And I'm going to ask all of you, do you even know what it sounds like when a woman laughs? It's not, Walt Disney kind of princess sounding. It's weird. It's funny.
Please do a Walt Disney.
It's at times maniacal. It's just extremely joyful. You listen to that, and I guarantee it's going to do something to you. It may make you or it may make you just feel really. It's in the set. Maybe we can play it at the end to close. So I think for us, we love the audio medium because it's intensely personal. It's not like watching a film, which is a very sort of, it's a group experience, really. It's intensely personal, it's in your ears. And you asked sort of, Sneha, what do you want from the show? I mean, I don't think Samyukta and I, we can't tell people what to do. We really don't want to tell people what to do. It's really for you to think, listen to these episodes, have this intensely personal experience with the audio, and decide what you want to do with it. You know, you want to go out and be a more compassionate person to someone's struggle on the street. You want to be more alert to what's happening around you. That's great. You want to revel in someone's joy. We have an episode of, you know, where someone is watching someone spend some time with someone they love on this, you know, basically they're like a voyeur. Okay, and that's not great, but it's an intensely fun episode. I think you have to decide what you want to do with that. We've had great responses. People really like the show. It's a lot of hard work, so we spend a lot of time with our community. We're always open to stories, so if any of you say, hey, you know what, I have this thing that I've never told anyone, please come and tell us. We'd love to have you on the show. There's an open
invitation from Radhika to come and spill your guts to her and Samyukta for a future episode.
I'm going to say that we also have some male voices on the show as well. They are, of course, talking about women in their lives. But it's always good when men talk about women in their lives. So, like, yeah.
Women in the audience, men as well, if you'd like to come and share some stories, please do. Ikyatha, I'm curious, where we talk about, we've talked about how podcasts are more accessible, how they reach a wider audience. Do you have a particular person in mind that you're making Slangaluru for? And how do you also choose what you're going to, do you have like a little personal dictionary of like slang words that you've written over the years? How are you choosing what topics to cover in each episode?
So most of the posts are just whatever comes to my mind. Words that I grew up listening to, words that I use, words that my friends use, my family, and words that I learned from followers. I learned one very interesting word called clean Krishnappa. So it means, when you go to a madhve, like a wedding, and there's this banana leaf, ele uta. So when you finish the whole thing very cleanly, then you say, nan full clean Krishnappa madbitte. So I get to learn so many words from them, it's so interesting. And there are so many words that I myself don't know. I'm like, oh my God, and I'm running Slangaluru. These people are teaching me words. So when I started it was just out of pure passion. I didn't have anything in mind, but I didn't know it will grow into such a community because surprisingly, not just Bangaloreans and Kannadigas. Like I said, people have moved to the city and who want to learn. Like you were saying, the slang bit was interesting for you. So someone commented on our podcast, the first episode, and said, I had actually started learning Kannada, but I had to stop. I think similar to your story. She had to stop for some reason, and now this has motivated her to learn the language. And I think usually when you see people fighting in the name of language or everything in our country, it mostly stems from people will become rebellious when you impose things on them or when you force things upon them. It is possible to teach people in a cordial way, in a fun way, and people are also interested in learning. Nobody's saying, no, I don't want to learn the language. I have gotten messages from people saying, you know what, I moved here and I really want to learn the language. So that's what, like I said before, it is possible to teach people. Everyone's enjoying it, right? That's the whole point. Why do you have to fight all the time? I've also been guilty of posting some Hindi imposition jokes and all. So that once in a while I do. So sorry about that. Yeah, so I think mostly it's about nostalgia and reliving the words that you grew up with. And sometimes I get to hear stories from people who grew up in the 70s that I don't even know of some of the places that they talk about. And when it comes to women content creators, see, when I started Slangaluru, people were really surprised. Like a majority of the people, apart from my people who knew of my identity, for like a year or so, people didn't know it was run by a girl. So when my first interview came out, I got messages from so many people, hudgina, I thought it's a guy, oh my God, because they relate colloquial slang and the way this rowdy slang or this rowdy language, they think only guys use it and they're so wrong. So I think also it's a place for women to, whether it's podcasting or social media, especially during the pandemic, people who have had restrictions growing up, restrictions at home, women who are married, but they can't really find a platform to express themselves. this is something that women can take up and they can share whatever they want, irrespective of what the topic is. And I think that's the beauty of it, Any woman, whether you're married and say for 10 years you were not allowed to work, but here you have something where you can express yourself, and I think that's really great, right? Like a lot of women are coming out and showcasing their talent, and even if it's just a reel, that itself is you're creating content, and your point is you're enjoying it. So that's the best part. And when women speak up, or for that matter, when you speak up, when you have an opinion, when you have a page, when you create content, people will keep shutting you off. The patriarchy will always be there. For that, in Kannada, we have just 2 words, amikon kutko. So you do whatever you want, just don't hurt anyone. And I think that's it.
That's brilliant. I think before we hand over to the audience who might have some questions, we've spoken about how podcasts make certain kinds of communication more accessible to people, especially, for example, in the case of research and reports, and how, many people can access them and listen to them. I'm interested in, the specific case of city podcasts. Whose voices are we also, showcasing? Whose voices are we listening to? Who gets to speak on behalf of the city? So I'd like, Radhika, you to answer from the Uru perspective through the Uru podcast, because again, that's got multiple stakeholders in the city who are featured on, various episodes talking about sustainability. How did you kind of go about deciding or choosing people? And do you sometimes have this concern that, are we being inclusive enough or enough voices heard? Can you just talk a little bit about that selection process?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, all the time. We're constantly conscious of it. I think the idea, a tough question, Menaka.
I'm just telling you all now, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we made the show, it's easy to fall back into kind of like, especially if you're making a city show, and Uru is a city show, to fall back on like kind of, let's get an expert opinion here. So we wanted the episodes to not be kind of interview style. We wanted it to be more like an engagement and a conversation. So what we've tried to do is ask questions. So where each episode is structured around a question, and it's a very simple question. We're talking about SDGs, but where basically each episode is like, is my city growing too big? Will we run out of food and water? Is my city a good place to work in? And I think by asking the simplest and most basic kinds of questions, we've sort of tried to open out the conversations to, how would different people talk about, like, is my city a good place to work in? Rather than saying, let's talk about economic opportunities and inclusivity in the city, or, something like that. And so we've tried very hard, and what we've tried to do is just go out and ask people these questions. Each episode is anchored by a member of the Bengaluru Sustainability Forum Steering Committee, and they themselves are kind of a group, a very diverse group of people who are interested in working on sustainability in the city. And then we've gone out and we've sought different sort of clips and opinions, and just sort of like, we've asked people these questions. One thing we're very excited about is we've asked all of these questions to very young people. So I think, we have people, young children in school. I think the age group like 6th standard, 7th standard onwards. Like, we have an episode on, I think, biodiversity and like biodiversity and I think food. And, so it's quite it's linked to some SDG on like good well-being and I don't know, something. I can't remember them. But we asked these kids, what's your favorite thing to eat? And it's really sweet. I mean, I hope you listen to that episode. And then the topics range, the things they like range from like anna saru to like pizza, and I hate broccoli, and I love lemon rice, and I like chitranna. And like, I think we tried as much to let people answer the question in their own way. I'm sure we could do much, much better. And, hopefully in future episodes we will. But
it's going to be great. Sneha, can you talk a little bit about that? Because you yourself admitted that you wanted to be more accessible, but by having a podcast in English, it is, of course, accessible to a percentage of the population. But you also do have interviews with people in Hindi, for example, in other languages. So can you talk a little bit about how you make some of these choices? Also, how do you, I've listened to the episodes, you talk about women drivers, you talk about women's relationship and how they feel about Ola, Uber drivers. You've talked about the hijab with Dr. Kavita Krishnan. So there are so many ways that you can approach this. Can you talk a little bit about your own selection process and, how you kind of work around some of these issues of access?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm a legal researcher by work. The podcast is a very small part of my job. So basically what I do is research. That's basically full-time. I think I get to spend around 2-3 months a year making the podcast. So I've been doing it simultaneously. So to be honest, when I started the podcast, I thought 15 people will listen to it because I was I wanted to do a podcast dedicated to feminist urbanism. A lot of people were like, what does that mean? And I was like, I just found out. So let me just I'm one of those people, when I read something really interesting, I want to tell people. And this was something that I felt and this was at the height of the pandemic. There was nobody. I was doing research on women's access to the city when the entire city's access was shut down. So I was in my house, and I was living with my mom, and I kept telling her, oh my God, this is the research. And she basically had a very typical answer saying that, shut up. It doesn't make any sense. And a lot of those conversations happened, and I felt what? I wanted to empower a lot of young women to have arguments with their parents with research. That very honestly is where it started. And I basically convinced my organization and everybody and said, it's important to make law more accessible to the people that we advocate. But the thing is, this question of inclusivity didn't really come from that perspective, but fundamentally because law itself is so inaccessible to a vast majority of people in the country. And a vast majority of the people in the city we're not taught municipal law in law school, by the way. It's not a subject, at least unless it's an elective somewhere. So most people graduate from law school without having any idea how cities themselves are governed. The fact that urban planning has to be done by the municipal corporation, the fact that there were a lot of these questions that were already inaccessible to lawyers themselves. So my perspective here, it was directed to a policy audience to say that, and there was such exciting research. And you talk about a lot of the people I interview are also academics. And by the nature of history and politics, the academics and their representation is in a particular way. But where I did have choice was to think about what is a woman's issue. So we have done episodes on, women's safety, women's pleasure, feminist mothering, politics of what happens to NT and DNT communities and women in those communities. We have done episodes on rental discrimination against Muslims in the city. We have done an excellent episode on caste and religion-based segregation, residential segregation in Bangalore. So these were some of the episodes where I got to, because we assume that rental housing is not a question that affects women, or the fact that Muslims who are being discriminated against are uniquely discriminated against as Muslim women. And there is a lot of complexity, which I've realized. So my focus was on the figure of who's missing in these discourses, and how do I sort of interrupt that and make it better. So for instance, in this season, I have interviewed Dr. Harini Nagendra, who talks about urban ecology. Somebody who talks about Kavita Krishnamurthy, who's done on making public parks inclusive for children with disabilities. And a big problem is we don't see children, cities are not made for children, and often for a child to access the city, the mother has to be able to access the city. So for me, inclusion sort of came in terms of how much can I expand so that this feminism is not a woman's problem, but a people's problem. So for me, where I started thinking about was, to be very honest, to reach a vast majority of this country, you cannot speak in English. You have to have a language that they can hear, understand, and participate in. And I'm a Telugu-speaking person living in Bangalore, trying to learn Kannada, and there were a lot of problems with respect to that. So when there is a guest who's more comfortable in another language, I'm very happy to sort of have them speak, and that's usually been Hindi based on that. But we've been discussing how to make the podcast more accessible, maybe come out with transcripts, make it accessible to persons with disabilities. So those are things that we're constantly thinking about. So I think, so I'm very happy that there is so much interest in the podcast in the first place. So I think that's what
for that. Okay, I've exhausted all my questions, so I'm going to hand over to all of you in the audience. Does anyone here have questions for any of our panelists about their podcast? Yeah.
So actually this question is for all of you, and it's more on the back end of how you make a podcast, because you're all researchers, journalists by background. And this is an exercise in storytelling, so you are essentially curating also the story. So how much of it do you, while production, how much of it do you kind of edit or curate in that sense before you release? I mean, because you have to add audio, like different kinds of music or other sounds to make it easy to kind of go along with. So I just wanted to understand how much of it do you think about, and how much also do you already script before you, while you're speaking, or is it just natural, organic, free-flowing? Yeah.
Hello? Yeah. So I think for all our, all the different kinds of podcasts that we make, and they range from the kind of heavy documentary to very sort of cinematic to interview style, all our shows are heavily produced in the sense that we add music, we edit a lot, we clean it up, we do a lot of sort of post-production work on them. That said, all of the conversations that you hear and all of the voices that you hear they're not necessarily scripted. There is a host narration that is scripted, for example, for City of Women in some of the episodes where you have a host who's sort of taking you along. But yeah, we do produce our episodes. It just makes the listening experience far more pleasurable, right? So, anyone else?
So for the Slangluru Sochcast, because it's a collaboration with Sochcast, they take care of the editing, the mixing, adding the music and producing it. The content creation comes from me, and obviously for the conversational Kannada bit, I need to prepare properly because I can't keep teaching people wrong Kannada. They'll toop at my face. But for the slang bit, it just comes to my mind. Whatever comes to my mind, I just teach people on the spot. And it's mostly, there's not too much editing because we just keep it short and we don't do a lot of extra, I don't do a lot of extra talking. So it's just a small podcast. It's a mini podcast. So there's not too much that's cut out.
Okay. My experience with this has been a little different. I think you were trained. I mean, and I think I didn't have anybody nobody knew how to do a podcast. Like, at least I was in my office. I think our organization had another podcast, which in a different branch. And so I just bought equipment off the internet and like started recording in my house, which is why I don't think my podcast quality is at the level of City of Women at all. So I just spoke to a few friends who had done podcasts for their organizations. And again, this is a policy podcast, so we did not expect a lot of people to listen to it in the first place. So I just I found out that there were open source music files online. So you pick something for the intro, there's an outro music. And I think for the trailer, we spoke to a studio. But the thing is, most of the episodes in season 1, at least, like I listened and I learned how to edit on Audacity, which was fairly easy, but extremely time consuming. I did not know what I was taking on when I started it. But for some episodes where there wasn't a lot of substantive editing, that somebody just had to listen and clean up, I found a studio and I coordinated with them. But I mean, I found that it was a lot of work when I was doing it by myself, so it's not super produced, but what it taught me is that it's something that you can learn. If I could learn, I think anybody can learn. And it's just, you just need a quiet place, a good mic, and people who are willing to give you time. So for me, thankfully, when I do interview episodes, I don't have to script them as much. I take up a bunch of questions I am interested in asking them, and I discuss with them beforehand. But for, say, my introductory episode or concluding episodes where I'm trying to introduce people to a idea or like a particular form of sort of theoretical aspects, those were certain things where I needed to create a flow. So I guess that.
Yeah, can I? So my question is to Ms. Sneha Visakha. So I would just like to say,
without men reforming themselves, without men bringing in change in their character and their attitude towards women, changes of feminism is not possible in an easy way. So just 5 points which you would like to point out what men can do so that women can access cities better. Please don't state the obvious ones. I would just request some insightful and deep observations and thoughts.
I think if men start doing domestic work, a lot will change. I think that's my most banal but also the most insightful question. I was just reading an article today that a majority of women have to leave labor force because they have to become homemakers because men don't take care of the home. So very frankly, the biggest contribution men can make to feminism is to start doing the dishes and start cooking and taking care of their own children. So I think it starts from there, fundamentally, materially. After that, I think there are a lot of people better than me who've answered that question. But I think it just requires, I think, people to be empathetic towards themselves and each other. So if you're to your mother or your sister, whoever, if somebody's doing work, take part in it and share that. So I think, yeah.
Can I? So first of all, I would just like to. I'm sorry. My question is for Ms. Ikyatha. Well, first I would like to point out that generally intense association with or pride with one's language is often associated with right-wing thing. I'm not that kind of guy. But my question to you is that Bangalore has been an IT hub, especially attracting talents from all across the country, especially from the North Indians. Do you think, had it not been for this Bangaloreans, what they say, altruistic mindset that they respond to people in their own languages, wherein they don't make the outsiders feel that they have to learn Kannada in order to survive in the city, has made Bangalore better than its counterparts, say Hyderabad or Chennai, a better space for IT hubs or workspaces, something as such?
Too many things in it.
Just to shorten it, Bangalore is open for all languages, wherein you don't have to feel the necessity to learn Kannada to survive here. Do you think this has put Bangalore 1 foot above, I mean, a step ahead of other cities in India so as to grow as an IT hub?
So I'll be very honest here. I'm not a researcher or an analyst. And I'm not really sure if Bangaloreans being welcoming, unlike other states where we kind of adjust, accommodate, and speak to people in their respective languages. I'm not very sure if that's the reason for the IT boom or the IT growth or anything like that. But I'm sure it makes a lot of difference when people are deciding to, say, moving from the north to the south. Obviously, that makes a huge impact because people would like to move to a welcoming city, a city that's not forcing things upon them. And I'll be very honest, there are people who impose and force things even here. There are people everywhere like that. But from what I have noticed, it's lesser in Bangalore. So, because I recently found out from my friend who lives in Bombay that he was studying engineering here. And he told me that he had a really tough time because he didn't know Kannada and he was really ragged and then he was trolled and he was mistreated because of that. And that really disappointed me because that's a first-hand story that I heard of from a friend of mine, from a dear friend of mine, and the fact that he went through this was really painful. So I think it's up to us to make our cities welcoming and not impose things. And as for the IT boom and why Bangalore is the IT city, I really don't know. So.
Hello. Hi. I actually loved all the 3 podcasts which I actually listen to right now. Like the one, I'm a video producer, so I tell stories visually. So when it comes to podcasts, listening and not seeing anything, I've never imagined it. anytime I make a story, anytime I think of a story, I think it visually. I think of narrating it in such a way that visually it appeals, visually it contributes to the kind of thoughts that come to your head. What I saw from Radhika's podcast, the Bus 618, when I was listening to it, I was actually visualizing it. I was actually visualizing what happens when a woman sits in a bus and travels all over the place for twice or thrice. And frankly speaking, I came very early here. I was here at 5:30. And then I didn't know where to go, what to do. And then I was just roaming around Sadashiv Nagar. And that related to me, although it wasn't about me having lost or having any kind of thought. So basically what happens is like when narrations are good, when narrations are captivating, no matter what medium it is, be it podcast or YouTube or even broadcast, the narration has to be in such a way that it has to actually like hold on to you so that you continue listening. So my question is to Radhika, how do you plan a long form or a short form of this thing when the stories are very intense? And do you make a conscious effort to keep it under a certain timing? Because for us on YouTube or for us on podcast, like it's easier to switch from one podcast to other, one YouTube channel to the other channel. So we usually try and script it in such a way that it cuts short the time span. Or how do you think about it? Like how do you, because you work on that thing on a daily basis, so it might be a thing wherein like you have to come up with something.
Yeah, I mean, so there's the practical aspect of it, and then there's kind of the emotional aspect of it. The practical aspect of it is, of course, when you're making a show, you know roughly how long it's going to be, right? Bus 618, it's the particular style that it's made in, it's a monologue. It is what we call a mini. It's what we call like a small bite. It's like, imagine you're having like chaat, right? It's that piece of pani puri you put in your mouth. It's momentary, so we want it to be under a certain length. Our longer episodes are longer because we want a longer narrative in it. That's kind of the practical aspect. But I think when Samyukta and I make our shows, again, one of the feedback that, early on when we started, again in our great focus group, all of you should do focus groups, it's great. Our great focus group told us, gosh, your episode is 25 minutes long, nobody's going to listen to it. Indians want 10 minutes. Okay, 10 minute, 7 minutes, yoga, wellness, spirituality, some kind of like, like self-improvement, how to become an entrepreneur kind of stuff. So we were like, gosh, but like none of our stuff is like that. And so I think what we did was we let the audio lead. And that's something we learned over time. In the beginning, you come and you want to like cut it and be like in control. But I think the more you work in the medium, you realize that the audio takes control. The audio tells you when it's done, right? Bus 618, we had a lot of raw audio. It was a very long conversation that we did, I think, over 2 sittings. So, and then editing it down took a really long time. And it went through many iterations with production. Samyukta led on that one. The music, pauses, all of that. I mean, in audio, silence is also extremely meaningful. How do I put a silence in to make you stop and think? So it took a lot of time. But I think, gosh, this is like one of those esoteric answers, but it's like the audio will lead at some point and it'll tell you when it's done, kind of, if you know what I mean.
That's not the case with video.
It's not the case with video. I know.
Half a minute and you're gone. Yeah.
Sure.
Capture or you leave. That's
of course, we have audio rules, right? When you're using sound, you don't want the clip to be longer than so many seconds. When you're using music underneath, the music should be X seconds long. It should play by itself for X seconds, then have it duck under. All of that is there. You have all those techniques that you learn. But in the end, like if you ask me, why is this episode this long, 8 minutes long? Because it is. That's as long as it took to edit it out. But you should just, I mean, it's the joy of working in the medium that really helps us make the episodes we do. And the stories. I mean, really, if people didn't come forward and tell us these stories, And we never, one of the things that we get asked is, how do you structure your interviews? We don't. I don't have an interview style. I keep it completely unstructured. It's a conversation, and we just let the story come out. And people sort of say it in the way they want to.
I also just realized the answer to his question, why do people choose Bangalore and why do so many people come here? Have you seen our weather? So I'm pretty sure that's why everyone moves here, because I cannot imagine myself living in Chennai or Hyderabad, I'm sorry.
This was coming into Bangalore and I felt calmer as a person. I'm not joking. Like, I was recently in Hyderabad and I remember thinking, wow, maybe this weather actually has an effect on people's moods, because it does. And I remember I was also coming back from Delhi back to Bangalore, and there was a heat wave at the height of it in April. Birds were falling off in the sky and you get angry. And also there's actually research that backs up that extreme weather events are linked to increase in violence against women and girls. So that's actually documented with climate change and everything. So I don't think you're wrong to link it. I don't know the studies on this, but I agree.
Study it, you can just feel it.
Yeah. But don't take it for granted. I mean, it's all becoming worse. Listen to Uru. It's all about sustainability.
Yeah, like, we're good at everything except winning the IPL, so